welcome. But she was exceptional, like super high performer, super great in
The
her
problem
role.
child that's exceptional.
Exactly.
Okay.
But terrible at communication, terrible at partnership, so good at her job. And I remember I sat in on her cross calibration and she was rated a 5 out of 5. She was up for promotion and we all sat in this room and I couldn't help myself. I go, does anybody like her? Like it just slipped out because I was so shocked to see her name in this discussion list. And all of a sudden, one by one, people are like, oh, well, my team avoids her. Well, my team doesn't work with her. Well, my team will basically do anything possible to not have to go to her desk. Well, my team. And then I'm like, is this the type of person that we want moving up? Is this the type of person we want managing people if we're having such a struggle with their soft skills? And it dropped them from a 5 to a 2 in one conversation. And in some ways, you feel bad because you're like, but they are so good. But this is what happens in cross calibrations is it's not just your manager. And this is where I think a lot of people struggle is because they say, well, my boss went for it, but it didn't happen. If your boss ever tells you they put you up for promotion, but they couldn't get it passed, you need to be doing more networking. You need to be meeting more people.
That's exactly right. Because the reason you didn't get it is because of something that the others don't know about you, which goes right back to the same thing about networking.
Welcome back to Secrets of a Corporate Game. So many people are trying to navigate a corporate world that is laden with secrets, cleverly hidden and unspoken rules to a game that most employees don't even know they're playing. On this podcast, we try to give you a peek behind the curtain and unveil some of those secrets with tips and tricks that you can apply today to start taking control of your career and progress up the ladder faster. Back today, we are talking about the corporate game, a topic very near and dear to my heart and what kind of spurred all of this engagement with you all with a literal idol of mine, a career coach, an author, a content creator. This is the job doctor, Tessa. She recently wrote a book called The Unspoken Truths for Career Success, which we were reading in my book club. I'm a huge fan. Welcome, Tessa. It's great to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you. This is going to be a very juicy conversation, I think.
I'm excited.
Two career coaches in the same room. It will be interesting.
And one with the HR perspective, right? Your background is in that recruiting, me coming from more the technical side of the corporate world and how those things manifest. So I'd love it if you could give the audience a quick little introduction into your background and then also into your coaching that you offer now.
Sure. I was in HR for about 25 years and I worked in small startups to really fast growing companies. That was my niche in technology companies and in Fortune 50 companies. So I decided at some point after about 25 years that I was going to serve the other side of the equation and help people figure out how to navigate the workplace rather than just protecting the companies all the time.
I absolutely love that. And I think it's such a great reframing, right? It's the same tools, right? But you've got the insider knowledge. And a lot of the time I find with my audience, it's that lack of insider knowledge that makes so many people struggle. And so, we talk about the corporate game, you on your social media content in your book. I talk about it a lot. What do you think is the biggest game that people are playing in the corporate world?
Well, I know it's a game. Many people call it a game, but really it all has its roots in just conversation and what's really happening. And what I find is that we walk around having halfway conversations all the time. So it's not as much a game as it is how to decode what's actually happening. Because I believe that people inherently are trying, some people, I think inherently people do, but you also have to understand companies. Companies will always take as much as you'll give, and there's certain companies have to make a profit. So there's certain things about companies that you have to understand in order for you to position things correctly and to play the game, as you say.
I totally agree with you. And, it's interesting. I think playing the game gets a bad rep because we think of it almost like a manipulation, right? Oh, I'm going to do certain things. I'm going to be fake in a certain way and it's going to help me be successful. Like nobody, I don't think, especially on this episode, neither of us want you to become the sleazy car salesman who's navigating the corporate world that way. But
yes,
nobody tells you how things work. And
That's
something
right.
that I talk about is it's like playing chess if you don't know any of the rules. Odds are you're going to make bad moves. But if you can learn the rules, then you can figure out how do I to your point, decode. I love that. I feel like we're spies. We're decoding exactly what's happening around us so that we can be proactive and take the best actions for ourselves.
Well, I was thinking the other day, I've done probably 25 major reorganizations for a company. I've been in the room when the CEO was fired. I've been there for a hostile takeover, and I've laid off thousands of people. That's not a brag point, by the way. That's a sad thing that I had to do. But when you have done that much, you understand what's actually being said behind closed doors versus what's being said to the person. So for an average individual, they may say, I don't know why I didn't get the job or the promotion. They said I was really close to getting it, but you were in the room when you understood exactly why they're not getting the promotion. And so you start to understand that there are patterns that are taking place and things that you can teach people to get and unpeel what the truth is and make micro adjustments along the way so that they can build their career faster.
Yes. And something tangentially related that I'd love to get your perspective on as well is I find a lot of times we're all kind of tunnel focused.
Yes.
Right? Like your manager is thinking about your manager. They're not thinking about you, right? And the same way that you go to work and you do your job and you're not thinking about Joe Schmo in accounting and what's going on in his world, right? We tend to be very tunnel vision, very tunnel focused on ourselves. And as a result, we don't always take into consideration by not telling them the exact reason they didn't get the promotion, we're in fact hurting their later development, or we're hurting their current performance, or and because we're so focused on like, how do I make this as easy as possible for me?
We avoid conflict.
I would love your take on that, on like the tunnel vision and how we sometimes not forget, but we don't always prioritize helping the people around us understand the root cause of things.
Well, I think that the root is that we don't like conflict, and that exists outside of the workplace as well as inside the workplace. I find it interesting that I asked my followers, if something was going wrong or something was really bothering you at work, would you say it out loud? Would you talk to somebody about it? 94% said no way. I would leave the company before I would say anything. And in fact, the younger they went, Gen Z said, I shouldn't have to write the script, which I find fascinating. Because in a marriage, you can't just assume somebody knows what you want. You have to be able to express it. And my theory is that the younger we go in generations, the more of a swipe right, swipe left world they have lived in. And it's easier to cancel than to engage. And they just simply don't know the skills to engage. And it's a little threatening to them. So that's why, of all the phone calls that I get and Rent My Brain sessions I do with people, it almost always boils down to, how do I communicate to get to the truth? How can I have the conversation that feels so hard and so scary?
Layering on top of that, it's so interesting that you bring like the Gen Z into this, because I do think they have a kind of like ride or die mentality of like, okay, well, we're not riding, so you're dead to me kind of ride or die.
Right.
And I think a huge part of that also, in like my opinion, being more in the middle age wise, is company culture has a big part to play in that too. Right? I've worked for companies where today, for example, I went to my boss and said, hey, I have a frustration in this area. I'm going to need some upline support. I'm looping you into this conversation. Totally feel comfortable. I have worked in other organizations where I would know that that's not an option because the company culture is not receptive to it. So I think there's almost this interesting fine line of like, I see Gen Z's point if you're in a company that has a really toxic culture. But if you're in a company where your boss really cares about you, you have open communication, you've built, to your point, the foundation of being able to communicate effectively, then leaving seems almost like a rash decision or a negative decision because it's going to hold you back from some of that.
Well, I think we make one-dimensional choices sometimes, and it seems really one-dimensional to say, the company is toxic, therefore I shall leave. Because when you go to a new company, you're going to have to put 20% extra effort to finding the job, proving your worth. And sometimes if you think about, well, would I be willing to put 10% more effort into communicating or learning how to communicate what's wrong and on the chance that we can fix it, it would be an easier path to stay. But often we want to make the quick choice and think it's going to be simpler, and it is not simpler most times.
The classic grass is greener example, right? And I would say, I've had a fairly successful career. I've worked in some, of the largest companies in the world. I've worked in startups. I have a similar kind of background to you on the technology side. And I would say there are some companies I've worked for where I've now, having coached, I've worked with enough people from those companies. I've worked in that company long enough to know that no, there really is just like a really bad culture. But I
Yes.
think to your point, there are other companies that I worked for, especially when I was younger in my career, that I'm like, oh, this is horrible and nobody cares and it's awful. And looking back, I'm like, man, I just didn't know how to navigate it. It's not that the company was bad.
Yeah.
I just didn't have the skills. And so on that, I'd love to hear from your perspective. You've been in HR, a lot of companies, you've worked with tons of clients. What are some of the biggest frustrations you hear working in corporate? And then what are things people can do to make that grind just a little bit easier?
Well, I think that the deepest need that everybody has at work, almost universally, is the need to feel like they're making a difference. And in companies, particularly if they're operating off of kind of an old school top-down model, it's do what I say. We treat employees more like a cog versus humane leadership, which I think is the model that's coming now into vogue with the help of Gen Z. Thank you. And we're realizing that we're working with real people who have real lives, who have real needs, and that balance rather than the suck it up or die mentality that Gen X that I grew up with, I think is actually making our workplaces better overall. But it will take helping a generation who doesn't necessarily understand how to do conflict or who thinks all conflict is bad, how to help them understand that actually there is good conflict and there's a way to have conflict that builds partnership and builds trust, but it means assuming good intent. And in a cancel culture, that's pretty tricky. We're very polarized. And so I teach people at its very most basic level to memorize these 3 questions, even if you botch the whole conversation about conflict. Do you see it differently? Is that what you intended? And is there something I'm missing that would help me understand? Those 3 magic questions help open the aperture to continue a conversation and assume good intent in another person rather than my manager's screwing with me, which is most often what I hear.
I'm going to add a question number 4 to there that I often tell clients that I love that I think goes really well with your 3 is there something you need me to be doing differently?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I love that one.
Because a lot of the time we go to our boss and we go, you're micromanaging me. I'm using an example. Right? I hope you wouldn't say it like that, but I've heard it. So it's happened. But, we go to our boss, we say, you're micromanaging me. And I'm like, how much better would that conversation would have been if you'd said, hey, lately I've noticed you've been requesting a lot more frequent updates of me. Is there something you need me to do differently?
Oh my gosh, I love that.
Does that open up that conversation so much more? And it allows you to take personal ownership because while I agree your manager should have been forthright and said, hey, this is what I need, this is what's going on my side, they're clearly not. So how do you give them a safe space to give you that feedback so that you can continue to grow rather than getting stuck? And so I love your 3 questions because I think they hone in on that. Do I not have the context? Is there something that you're intending here that I'm missing in how I'm receiving your feedback? Like I love that openness because again, to that tunnel vision, sometimes we think, well, my manager just hates me. Like we get into this such an emotional headspace that we can't separate ourselves and go, okay, clearly they need something different from me. How do I figure out what that is so that we can both be successful in this situation?
Well, having heard conflict between managers and the people that work in these companies for decades now, I can tell you that the conversations that go sideways almost always go sideways because we're assuming bad intent in the language that we use, in the insinuations, whether it be, insinuating that the manager is taking advantage of you because you're doing the work of 3 or 4 people and they're doing that on purpose. That would be a really common one in today's world. Or that they're just expecting you to, suck it up without getting paid and doing more. But when you come at it from, here's what I'm seeing and here's what I would expect and here's this gap, is that what you intended? It's an entirely different conversation because it allows the conversation to continue to move forward. But in today's world, often I see we go scorched earth and then people say, I was fired. I said something and I was fired. So you can't be open. And it's like, yeah, you can't take a scorched earth approach or you will get in trouble, but neither can you be silent. So where's that in between ground that you need to be? And that's what I try and teach people is this moderate ground.
Absolutely. And it's, you're honing in on something that I think is so key. And it's something that I work so often with my clients is it's not what you're saying, it's how you're saying it. The
That's right.
tone and the language of the conversation is what's driving the reaction. So if you keep getting fired or shut down or pushed back for something you're trying to communicate, it's in the way you're communicating it, right? And how do we rethink that? And I think touching on one more point that you had highlighted, your boss has more context than you do, period, all the time.
True.
And even if you have an incredibly transparent, great leader, there are things they're holding back so as to not stress you out, so as to be able to advocate for you, so as to be able to lead you effectively. And so coming at it from the approach of like, is this your intent or is there context I'm missing here? A lot of the time will save you from saying something stupid because you want to be like, no, you don't understand. And they're like, no, you don't understand because I'm sitting in closed door rooms and I'm trying to help you and you're making it very difficult, right? And I don't always want it to sound like we're taking the manager side because I don't think that's either of our intent. But when you become a leader and you look back, it's kind of like becoming a parent and you're like, oh, I'm so sorry for ages 12 through 18 when I was a child. You're right. I was terrible, Mom. It's the same kind of thing when you become a manager as you look back and you go, oh, I could have handled so many situations better then. And vice versa. As a manager now, maybe I'll make different decisions, right? And so there's that balance of like both sides taking ownership.
That's actually why I speak about micromanaging so effectively, is because I was a micromanager. I was the worst micromanager, had no idea until I had somebody actually talk to me about it. And so, yes, being a manager actually sucks. I think it's the suckiest job in corporate America is being a manager.
It's definitely the hardest.
There's a lot of people who say, I don't want to be a manager. I want to be an individual contributor. And I get it.
Yeah. And it's, it's so funny because I tell people this on, in coaching and even on my content. My reputation early in my career was that I was the ice queen. I was a terrible communicator. I was way too direct. I didn't know how to take other people's opinions in a constructive way. I only knew how to defend my perspective. And it took a leader who was very bold, who wasn't even my manager, who pulled me aside and said, everybody loves you. You are great at getting results. You are not going to move up until you fix this. And I needed that. And at the time, did I take it well? No. Did I probably hate him just a little bit for a little while? Absolutely. But looking back, that one conversation in that conference room changed the trajectory, not only of my career, but of my coaching career, because I was forced to learn these skills I wasn't good at. And then in turn around and teach them to other people. And so to your point, somebody tells you you're a micromanager and you're like, me? But you have two options. You either continue or you learn the skills to be better, and then you help everybody else be better with that.
That's why I think, it was so interesting for me when I was in the room when the CEO was fired, because we thought we were doing a stock option exercise. The CEO, the board member came in, fired the CEO, and I was just in shock, and he was in shock, and he walked out, and I thought, wow, he genuinely seemed surprised. It didn't surprise me, and I thought, how would he not know? And then I walked into the meeting with the new CEO who promptly said, I'm going to have to lay off half of the executive staff. My only question is, should you be one of them? And he proceeded to tell me that I had a reputation for not getting along with sales and that he needed me to play nicer with sales in order to be effective and him get done what he needed to do. I'd never heard the feedback in my life, had no idea. And luckily, he was honest. We started on that honesty the very beginning, and it ended up being I just loved this man. I mean, I worked there and absolutely loved him and had a successful time at that company under him. But we often don't know.
It's my favorite story in your book that I read, because when I heard that, it resonated so deeply with me because I've seen it from every angle. I've been the person who got the feedback who had never received it. No manager had ever told me I was too direct or that I didn't take constructive feedback. Nobody had ever given me that. And yet somebody I worked with on a project one time was like, yeah, you're going to fail if you don't fix this. And I needed that. And I've also had to be that person to people on my team and say, listen, I've given you this feedback 3 times nicely. Now I'm giving it to you directly. If you do not figure this out, you're going to get fired, whether I like you or not. We need to work together to figure this out, right? But managers don't do that. We're afraid of conflict, to your point. We don't know how to communicate it. So we try to nicely tiptoe, and then it ends with the person getting fired and being shocked, right? And so I think
it's punitive. Any conversation you end up having ends up being punitive. And so we're literally training our people that when we have these sit-down conversations to be afraid that there's going to be a punitive action. And yet what's coming into play now and what should have been there for decades is more of a coaching approach. If you're talking more to your people, it comes across as coaching, not punitive all the time. And especially if we're reinforcing the good things that they do, but that requires you to talk more and to address conflict earlier and to have that approach with your people and to have them begin to trust you.
Yep. And I want to add a quick caveat here. So if you are a listener and you're like, this all sounds great, my boss still sucks, right? Because it happens.
It does. Like, you bet it does.
Cursed me out in a conference room last week. Okay. If you're experiencing things to an extenuating degree, you should absolutely leave, right? If your boss is verbally abusive, if you're being put in situations that are not good for your mental or physical health, like if you are in positions where things are going to an extreme where you're being judged based on your race, your sexual orientation, your ethnicity, neither
Agreed.
Tessa nor I are advocating that you stay in a negative situation and try to coach up, okay? But there are plenty of bad managers on accident. And I think that's what Tessa and I are really trying to talk to is sometimes your boss just doesn't know they're bad. And like we can help them by teaching them some of these skills, by asking some of these questions.
I think there's more bad bosses than good bosses, quite honestly.
Oh, absolutely. Certainly.
Nobody gets training for this in college. You can go to a 4-year degree and you get maybe one class on it. I don't think people naturally know. They just learn from other leaders. And if a lot of other leaders aren't that great, we're perpetuating some bad leaders.
My favorite study was done by Forbes. This was back in 2017. It said the average manager gets training 11 years after they start managing people.
Oh my gosh, that makes me sick to my stomach. So if you are working for a manager
in their first 11 years, they're probably pretty bad, right? Like they don't know what they're doing. Yeah. And, I was lucky when I became a manager, I was immediately put through a management training at the company I happened to be at. The first time I led people, I was put through it. I was still bad, right? Yeah. I probably swing too far for micromanagement. I'm much more of an autonomous leader. Mm-hmm. But for junior people, that's actually worse. Because you're not getting direction. You're not getting good expectations. You're not getting good checkpoints. You're not being led effectively. You're being left to your own devices, which isn't good either. And so, sometimes it takes time for us to evolve into good bosses. I don't know that the people who reported to me on my first team would say I was very good. Sure. I know the people who work for me now have followed me from my last 3 companies and would continue to work for me because I've evolved those skills, right? So it's definitely a learning. And so if you're listening and you're like, I am a bad boss, you can learn these things. But if you're listening and your boss is toxic, do what's best for you. Be protective of your mental health. But then also be aware, to Tessa's earlier point, if you go somewhere new, it's not like you're magically going to have a good boss. You're still going to have to learn how to communicate. You're still going to have to learn how to self-advocate. Yeah. You're still going to have to learn how to do these things if you want to be successful.
Yeah. If you don't set good work-life boundaries in your last job, you're not going to set them in the new job. If you're not open in your conversations and communication in your last job, you're not magically going to do it in the new job. Those things will follow you.
Absolutely. So this is going to be kind of a fun episode because Tessa hosts her own podcast as well. So we are going to flip the script on her side so that Tessa, if you have any questions for me, that you would have your chance now to also ask me those.
Oh, I love it. Okay. I do have some great questions for you. I want to know from your perspective. Well, first of all, let's back up a bit. Will you introduce yourself to my followers and tell us a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. So I'm Kendall. I'm that career coach on all social media. And I've been coaching for about 6 years. It started really as a mentorship, as a life-giving exercise where I really wanted to help peers of mine who I saw struggle with things I struggled with. And it has evolved into a coaching practice, a podcast, an upcoming book in November. But my background is really being bad at my job. And this is what I always like to share with people is I've had a very successful career for somebody who started out really bad at their job. From a technical acumen perspective, I've always been very high performing. Can I get a bunch of stuff done? Can I solve problems? Can I get things fixed? Absolutely. Can I work 100-hour work weeks? Also, absolutely. But what I wasn't good at was communication, soft skills, brand building, networking, advocating for myself. And so I made every mistake you can possibly make and had to learn really quickly because I've always been in an executive facing position. My first boss ever was a CFO of a Fortune 100 company. We're talking like straight into the fire out of school. And so I've had to learn very quickly how to adjust my style and how to learn these things. And what I've learned on the back end is that nobody teaches it to you. Doesn't matter if you have your master's degree. It doesn't matter if you've been in the workforce 20 years. Nobody teaches you these things. You're just expected to muddle through. So all of my platform, all of my coaching, all of my support is geared towards helping people figure those things out much faster and much more easily than I had to in mine.
Well, okay. Given that background then, which I love, tell me what you see is the biggest single mistake people are making in their career as they're trying to navigate it. Do you see patterns that commonly show up over and over?
I'm going to give two answers because I think they go together and they're both equally important. So first is not having a personal brand. And I don't necessarily mean this in the cliche way of like, do you know how to introduce yourself to a stranger? What I mean is truly understanding the skills you have that differentiate you from the million other people who want your job. What are the things that you are exceptional at that you bring to your workplace that will help you solve the problems of the people who need you, right? So to me, brand building is a lot of problem solving. That's a lot of my personality type. And if you don't know what value you add, your career is going to stagnate very quickly. And a lot of people say, oh, well, I just need a job. I'll take this job. It's available. But if you're not well suited, if you don't understand your strategy going into it, you're going to plateau really quickly. And the second piece that builds on that is then using that brand to advocate for yourself. And we talked about it a little earlier. Your boss does not know what you're doing. They don't. Even if they're micromanaging you, they probably don't know what you're doing, right? Because there's so much nuance into how you handle things, what emails come your way, what meetings you're sitting on. And so if you're not effectively communicating not just the things you're doing, but the impact you're creating for the organization, again, you're going to suffer. And so what I see so often with clients that I work with is they don't know what they're good at, and then they don't know how to talk about what they're good at. So what happens is they end up in these very technical roles and they get stuck very quickly rather than being able to scale with these amazing other skills they have that they don't know how to talk about.
Well, this idea, I call it a value proposition. Knowing your value proposition, if you don't know what it is, I assure you they won't. And I tell people, I work with people, and it sometimes takes a good hour to figure out what it is. It is not something that AI can figure out for you on a resume. You can put in your job description all day long, and it is not going to tell a company the story around what you're good at and what your superpower is. That takes time. And I tell people all the time, like if I just pitch myself as a 25-year HR veteran who's run HR for companies, that's not nearly as compelling as saying, I'm the person you hire if you want to go fast and you want to go public and you need to get talent in place. I'm also the person that you'd hire if you want somebody to cut to the chase quickly and uncover what the problems are and fix them, and somebody who's very experimental. Now that's more what I'm saying when I say value proposition. And I think a lot of people that listen say, I just don't understand what my brand is. What are you saying? What's a value proposition or what's a brand? And it's really how you do things differently than somebody else.
Yeah. And mine for listeners is I am the person you put in a black hole. If there is an area of your organization where you don't know what's happening and nobody can explain it to you, I will add organization, I will add order to chaos, and I will solve your problems and have an impact so that your company can run more efficiently. That is my niche. That's my skill. And that's applicable in a lot of different areas. I've done it in finance. I've done it in ops. I've done it in technology. I've done it in data science. But I am the black hole person, which is to me very different from a jack of all trades, which is what I hear all the time. I'm a jack of all trades. That tells me nothing about what you're capable of.
That is a junk phrase. You're right.
But I can solve your black hole problem and bring you clarity and bring you efficiency. Tons of leaders need that, right? And so that's how I've differentiated myself from the jack of all trades, is that I am that person. And often, and I have lots of examples of where I've been able to do that. And so you're right, it does, especially in an interview, it's going to put you in a completely different league from somebody who says I'm an HR 25-year professional.
That's
totally different.
So once you understand your brand, your value proposition for a company, how do you use it then to get what you need or what you want? Tell me what you advise people to do once you know your superpower.
This is going to tie in a lot with the communication that we talked about earlier, right? You have to be building your communication skills in parallel with your personal brand. But what we're going to do with a brand is we're going to go out. So I think of your professional network as a tree. And I always, if you're on YouTube, you can see my hands. But the trunk of your tree is going to be like your manager, your skip level, your senior leader. That is the directional vertical support that you need. But a tree has a lot more branches than it does have a trunk. And you need branches that are going to support you in your career progression. And this could be peers, this could be your boss's peers, this could be your skip levels peers, this could be people at different companies. And so once you have your brand, what's really important to me and what I think really differentiates speed of progression, if that's a specific goal of the individual, is how many people do you have good relationships with? And so we take that personal brand and I go on what I call a roadshow, right? Who are all the influential people in my organization? How do I get in front of them for 15 minutes and say, tell me about you, tell me what you're good at, then I'll tell you what I'm good at, and we can build a reciprocating relationship where you can help me over the next 6 months, where you can coach me in what you're good at so that I can continue to build my skills. And we do this for 2 reasons. One, those branches are who's going to sit in the room to talk about progression and promotion when you're not there. And we want every single person nodding when they say Tessa, going, yes, she's great. Oh my gosh, you see how great she works with sales? You know, I talked to Tessa 3 months ago and she is wonderful. You know, we want that because people, even if they don't know you professionally, they'll stick up for you if they know you personally. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece is studies have shown people feel more fondly about the people they have helped than the people they have helped feel about them.
Yes.
So a lot of the time when it comes to mentorship, networking, building your brand, we think, oh, well, I need to be able to give them something. I need to be able to add value to them. The value you're adding is being someone that they can coach, that they can teach, that they can mentor. And so I'll say, you know, take your personal brand to these people, let them know who you are, build a reputation for yourself, and then figure out something they're good at that they can help you with. And set up regular sessions with them, whether that's every other month or that's quarterly, kind of depends on seniority, so that you're building those ongoing relationships, you're building that advocacy, and then they're 10 times more likely to stick up for you in a meeting, right? So you know what you're good at, you know how it's applicable, you meet all these people, and then I always give this example. The companies that I've worked for oftentimes do heat maps going into performance reviews. I don't know if that's something you've experienced in HR.
Sure they do.
But basically, like Kendall's on a list. Mark her green if you know her really well, yellow if you kind of know her, red if you don't know her at all. And I joined a company a few years ago, and the first time they ran this exercise with my name, I was green for everybody, in every department, at every level of leadership, in every team. And my boss was like, I've never seen anybody be completely green. Like, how do you know everyone? And I was like, well, I did meetings with 200 people when I joined, and I have quarterly meetings with all of their bosses every single quarter, because I know how important that is. And so once you have that, you're building that reputation. Now my boss's hardest job is like, don't get her poached. Keep her in the team, right?
Keep her here.
You've got this big network.
You're speaking to something that's actually really important. Being in HR, I've sat in on dozens of meetings where you decide who gets the promotions that year. And these and talent management meetings where they call it a 9 box, where we put people in these little boxes and say, who's going to get all the, you know, mentoring, training, benefits, promotions here in the company. So those conversations are happening behind closed doors. And I can tell you that almost without fail, 9 out of 10 times the reason the person doesn't get the promotion, I hear this: I don't know who they are. They may be great manager, but I don't know who they are. Or they certainly have not made their way to other parts of the organization. And I think that we need to see them in other settings before they get promoted. And so this idea of collaborating with other people, working well with other departments, and finding, I call it informal mentors. It's very similar to what you're saying. Find people that you can watch that do things well, like people who make good proposals, people that are able to bring people together, people that are good with conflict, people that are good with data visualization, and watch them. You don't have to ask them to be your mentor, but when it's your turn then to give a proposal, say, I've been watching you. Here's what I put together. What do you think? Would you give me some feedback on this? And that's a way that you can develop really great mentors without saying, will you be my mentor? Which I think is kind of not very useful sometimes.
Yes. No, it's so great what you're touching on. And this is something that I learned in my career. And I give this example in my book. In fact, is I had a coworker that I worked with once that my team had a lot of difficulty with. Okay. That's what we're going to say. Lots of difficulty. It's a nice way to put it. But she was exceptional. Like super high performer, super great in her
problem
role.
Child that's exceptional.
Exactly.
Okay.
But terrible at communication, terrible at partnership, so good at her job. And I remember I sat in on her cross calibration and she was rated a 5 out of 5. She was up for promotion and we all sat in this room and I couldn't help myself. I go, does anybody like her? Like it just slipped out because I was so shocked to see her name in this discussion list. And all of a sudden, one by one, people are like, oh, well, my team avoids her. Well, my team doesn't work with her. Well, my team will basically do anything possible to not have to go to her desk. Well, my team. And then I'm like, is this the type of person that we want moving up? Is this the type of person we want managing people if we're having such a struggle with their soft skills? And it dropped them from a 5 to a 2 in one conversation. And in some ways, you feel bad because you're like, but they are so good. But this is what happens in cross calibrations is it's not just your manager. And this is where I think a lot of people struggle is because they say, well, my boss went for it, but it didn't happen. If your boss ever tells you they put you up for promotion, but they couldn't get it passed, you need to be doing more networking. You need to be meeting more people.
That's exactly right. Because the reason you didn't get it is because of something that the others don't know about you, which goes right back to the same thing about networking.
Yep. And that's why I think, my platform started because I posted a video that said, the work you do in corporate is not as important as the relationships that you build. People have a very visceral reaction to that, right? Because we want it to be a meritocracy. They really do?
I'm surprised they have a visceral reaction to that.
4.1 million people had very different views on how they thought that
wow.
went.
Interesting.
And to me, your work is important. You cannot keep your job if you don't do your job. But the people who move up quickest are great communicators. They're great relationship builders. They're great networkers. They have their brand. They know what they're good at. They apply that skill effectively. And the people who get stuck do great work in their job. It is
not enough to be good at your job. You have to have high quality relationships with other people. I would agree with you.
And I think that's a hard lesson for a lot of people to learn because when you're more junior, let's say to the manager level, you can probably get to the manager level by just being good at your job and not having super strong relationships. But if you want to move to senior manager, director, senior director, VP, executive, head of, you have to be able to work with people. You have to be able to network. You're going to network your way into new jobs. You're going to network your way in your current job. And so that's where I think I talk about a lot. I think the director is the hardest jump to make in corporate.
It's a tough job.
I'd be curious to hear if you align with that in HR. But to me, the skills are so different at the director level and above. And it's so hard to showcase them when you're senior manager and below. And if you haven't had the relationships, that's where you get stuck. I see so many people get stuck there.
Yeah, I think moving into a director is a really hard transition to make. Your language changes a lot because your language now is about numbers and data and the language of business. So that's one thing I see that people really struggle with is how am I able to do that? How am I able to concisely share a story about why I need resources or why I need the budget or the prioritization? And I think that people also struggle with this idea of I don't want to be one of them, one of the out of touch senior people. So I want to be a friend of the people. And that doesn't work as a director, not meaning that you can't be friends with people, but you have to learn this delicate balance of being able to push back against things that may not make sense and the them that you've been, bad talking up until this point. And then you have to have a way to coalesce your people around a vision, sometimes one that you don't totally believe in. And I think that can be challenging, but anytime you get into an us versus them mentality as a director, I think that's the first sign you're not going to make it. What about you? Tell me what you think is so difficult.
Yeah, I think for me, I agree with you in your language of business and that now you're towing this different line. I think something else that I see people have a hard time with is the strategy component.
Yeah.
You
Going from
can-
tactical to strategy. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because
Mhm.
as a manager, you can manage a team effectively and have no idea where your team is going.
Yes.
Right? And be a good manager. But at the director level, you have to have a vision, you have to have a long-term strategy, you have to have a roadmap, and you have to be able to influence the overall company's strategy with your perspective. And to your point, sometimes you don't win and you have to do something you don't like to
That's
do,
right.
and it happens, right?
Yes.
But at the director level, it becomes more about clearing roadblocks, clearing escalations, and driving your team forward than the work. And I think that's harder work, right? Because now you're just in the interpersonal and you're just navigating personalities and you're just trying to figure out the right steps forward. And I think that people really struggle, not just in doing that at the director level, but how do you display that acumen at the senior manager level when you're not in those meetings so that they feel comfortable promoting you to director? And I think that's another reason why I see it be a sticking point.
I would agree. I think one piece of advice I give people is pay attention to how much time you're spending talking about the past, meaning what I've done, status updates, which is typically a manager, senior manager type of thing, versus proactively looking at the future, because directors have to be squarely in the future, so you're planning a year in advance. You're not planning a day or a week or even a month or quarter in advance. And so pay attention to your language to see if you've made that bridge to be kind of 80. If you think of the 80-20 rule, 80% should be talking about the story of the future 3 to 5 years out. And what are you doing to build that, versus 20% going backwards in time. What have we done? And reassessing that.
I would say one more tactical thing to go with this, since we are both tactical coaches, is I tell directors to bucket their work into thematic stories, right? So the work that your team is doing generally will fit between 3 and 5 themes, right? Depending on the type of work that you do, right? So in HR, maybe it's people development, maybe it's recruiting and retention, and maybe it's education and future learning, right? In, the finance side, maybe it's automation, maybe it's reporting, and then maybe it's, new initiatives and new projects, new policies. So I generally will tell them, if you can bucket it into themes, then it helps you with both 80 and 20. It helps you formulate a vision for the future. It helps you talk about that vision. It helps you organize yourself to that vision. And then when you have to talk retroactively, it ties to the themes of the future. It ties to those same areas, as opposed to feeling like two disjointed concepts.
Oh, that's a great way to do it. I like that a lot. That's very good.
My brain organizes better that way. And then I'm like, oh, now I know where I'm going, right? My team. I laugh if you ask anybody who works for me. I don't know if we discussed this earlier. I do still hold a corporate job. So this is like a hybrid for me.
I did not know that.
Yes.
Stop for a minute. What is your corporate job now?
So I'm the head of IT strategy and planning for a bank. So I'm responsible for workforce, finances, strategic direction, and roadmaps for technology. And if you ask anybody who works for me what we're focused on right now, they would all yell automation and then hide, because that has been shoved down their throats by me for the last 2 years. Like, we are not in a sustainable mode. We have to automate. We have to organize. We have to get as much manual work off our plates as possible, because more work is coming and we're not going to be able to do it the way we're doing it right now. But to me, that is very motivating. Now, I was talking about this with somebody yesterday. I think this is a hard balancing act for leaders as well, is my team does not know every task I have planned for them for the next 2 years, because I'm a big believer in mental load, right?
Okay. So mental load. Tell me what mental load means.
So in a marriage, wives complain a lot. I shouldn't have to tell you to do the dishes. I shouldn't have to tell you to go to the grocery store. And the reason is because the mental load is already there. We're already thinking about the fact that we have to do the dishes, and we have to go to the grocery, and we have to take the kids to the doctor, we have to take the dog to the vet, and we have to go to baseball practice. And once the mental load is there, that's most of the work. And so the reason people get frustrated in relationships when we say, well, you should just know, is because the mental load is the exhausting part. It's not the act of doing dishes. Yeah, that sucks, but it takes 10 minutes. It's the mental, like, oh, I have to do dishes, that bothers us for 8 hours before we do it.
Oh my gosh, I'm so using those words. I'm using them at home now all the time.
It's a therapy term of, like, we are hosting the mental load in our relationship, right? It's very common in women, partially because our brains organize differently than men, but also because we don't communicate as effectively. Like, hey, I need you to proactively be doing this, because me reminding you is the part that's hard for me. We don't understand that about ourselves. But if we put that in terms of work, if you have a really heavy workload, even if you're completing everything within 40 hours, the mental load of all the things you still have to do that you haven't gotten to can very much derail your sense of satisfaction or achievement.
Oh, I have not heard this concept before. So you're blowing my mind right now, and I love it so much. So let me make sure I understand this. You keep your people really focused on the most important things rather than give them dump the whole enchilada on them of where everything needs to go over the next few years because of mental load.
Yes.
And because the very act of carrying too much in your brain will wear you out, even if the job itself is not wearing you out. The mental load can wear a person out.
Absolutely.
And fatigue them.
And that's why people burn out so quickly, even if they're not working overtime. Like, to me as a manager, overtime is not indicative of burnout. Mental load is indicative of burnout. And
let me say that for people. Yeah. Mental load is indicative of burnout, not work hours.
Mm-hmm.
Big.
Because I could work 10 hours a week, but if my mental load knows there's so much more that has to get done, I'm exhausted, right? And I tell people during very busy seasons, when you log off work, what do? You go sit on your couch, you watch a mindless TV episode while you eat dinner out of a box, and you try to just decompress because your brain is too full. And it doesn't matter if you worked long hours that day or not, it's the knowledge. And so my team knows we have a direction, we have places we're going, we have things we want to accomplish. There's a future for them, especially in an automation phase. It's really important your team knows, like, hey, once we're automated, we're not automated out of a job. There's more stuff coming. But they're not thinking about the 52 things I have planned. They're thinking about the 2 things they need to deliver in the first half, or the 1 thing they need to deliver in Q1. Because then what happens is they get a great sense of accomplishment. They have a great sense of focus. They're able to disconnect from work more effectively and come back more refreshed. And then we jump into the next thing. And so it's that balance of, hey, the team needs to know you have a strategy. They need to know you have a vision. They need to know you have a future for them and that it ties to their goals. But they don't need to be overwhelmed with all the things you're protecting them from. And so for me, that's a balancing at the director level that's a little more challenging.
Well, that's a great manager tip. And it actually explains a lot of why I was so exhausted. You know, my son had this accident, and for those that are just catching up on it, he tried to take his life, and he ended up shooting himself, and he became paralyzed, and he came home. And then I had the job doctor business and an adult son who needed tons of medical care. And basically over the last 6 months, I haven't done a lot of work as a job doctor, but I've been exhausted with the job doctor. It's mental load. It's knowing all the stuff that we have that is there and out there, even if I'm not doing that exhausted me. It wasn't that I was overworking myself with the job doctor. That's just such a great concept.
Yeah, I think it's hard for people because the advice we tend to give is like, well, just don't think about it, which is not.
Yeah, don't think about it. Pretend it's not there.
Yeah, and you're like, that's not super helpful. And it actually took an employee of mine for me to realize this mental load concept because he struggles with a lot of anxiety. And he is my top performer. He is wonderful. He delivers everything great. I would never say a bad word about him. Like, he's taken mental health days. I'm fully supportive of that. But it took him for me to realize that it didn't matter if I was running interference. It didn't matter if I was clearing roadblocks. It didn't matter if I told him to log off and not do the work. The stress maintained the same level. And so I did a lot of research into why that could be happening. And this mental load concept is one that I came across. And for him, it was the mental load of knowing all the things he had to do that kept him stressed. And so what we ended up doing was hiring somebody, redistributing responsibilities and ownership so that he could release some of the mental load and not have to carry as much, because that helped with balance. And so it's just something that I think is going to become more popular in management in the future. And I think it's something we're still learning a lot about. It's something I've only recently adopted. And so it is going to be one of those things that we have to find a balance between giving motivation, inspiration, direction, and then making sure mental loads are healthy enough that people are able to decompress and come back to work refreshed.
What I like that you're saying, transparency is kind of a hot topic right now too. We want to be more transparent with our people, make them our partners, but too much transparency can create greater mental load too. So you're right, there is this balancing act. And especially with anxiety, or the rates of anxiety among our young workers is unbelievable. And I don't know that we fully understand how to best manage that yet, but it certainly is something that we need to be aware of.
Yeah. Awesome.
Well,
I feel like we have covered like a ton of topics.
Yeah,
in
I
a
think
very
we've
short
got a
period. So what I always like to do is I like to end my episodes with asking my guest, what is one tactical piece of advice for listeners? If they were going to go do one thing tomorrow that's different than how they've been operating, what would be the one thing you would encourage them to go do?
Now, you're going to have to edit this out because I don't even know the answer to that. I have to think about that. I guess the one thing that I would suggest that people do is the one conversation that they should have been having, everybody has one, that they should have been having at work, usually with their manager. Just spend some time writing down that conversation. I have a framework for that, but you probably do too. And go have the conversation that you need to have. We know that work satisfaction directly correlates with how much of a voice you have. And so the very act of having the conversation that you're afraid of having, I think, is really important, particularly if you use those 3 magic questions that I set out earlier so that it can be a productive conversation. I think that sets in motion not only help towards that particular problem or will illuminate what you need to know, because sometimes you need to leave a company and that will illuminate the fact that you need to leave. But it will also set you on a course of realizing that if you can stop having halfway conversations and begin having real conversations at work, you can make micro adjustments that will dramatically increase your satisfaction in the workplace, whether it's at this company or another one.
I think that's wonderful advice. And everybody who's listening and who's going, oh, but I don't want to, just do it. I always talk to clients, this is information seeking. Even if you get a bad answer, now you have an answer and you can decide how to react to it, right? Even if it's not the response you're hoping for. And so I love that. I think that's a great takeaway. So for anybody who's tuning in who is wildly resonating with your fabulous advice, where can they find you? How should they reach out to you? How do they get more information from the Job Doctor?
I am Job Dr. Tessa everywhere. So you can find me primarily on TikTok and Instagram, or where most of my followers are, but you can find me about everywhere. And thejobdoctor.com is my website, and that's where you can get coaching and you can get early access to mentoring programs that I have. And my book, The Unspoken Truths for Career Success, is in bookstores everywhere and on Amazon.
Awesome. Well, we will link that in the show notes, both the link to your website, your social media, and to your book, because it is a fabulous read. I read it with my book club this month and I thought it was amazing. So,
question for you. Okay, let's end with a question for you. What is the one, if you had one piece of advice that you think is the most valuable that you want people to know, what would it be? That's pretty broad, isn't it? That's big.
I would say in the next 2 weeks, go meet 5 new people. Whether that's in your company and that's in your division, whether that's people in your broader network, maybe that's people at a company you would ideally like to work for in the future. My goal for you would be make sure that you are expanding your network intentionally and building those relationships, right? We've covered a lot of topics on today's episode that you could go start applying, but to me, that is going to be the number one differentiator in your long-term career, is where can you meet and build substantial relationships.
I love that. And where could people find you if they are looking for your content?
Awesome. So I am That Career Coach everywhere. Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn. You can find me all these places. Thatcareercoach.net is my company website where you can reach out if you want coaching. And then my book, Secrets of the Corporate Game, is coming out in November. So more to come on that in the future as well.
Thank you so much for being on the show. It is so much fun to talk to you. And I hope this isn't the last time we talk.
If you're listening in and you love today's episode, please give us 5 stars. Please subscribe, leave your comments below, and we look forward to having you back on the next episode.